Okay. Okay.
Yeah, recording.
We are. Well, thank you for coming to our second talk here in our series on the historical roots of our times. This time we are going to have a presentation on democracy under attack, personal and historical perspectives on the 6th of January, 2021, with two of my colleagues, Jodi Bilinkoff, professor of history, and Chuck Bolton, professor of history and associate dean. This is a great opportunity for us to hear firsthand and also historically some context to put what happened in the 6th of January into some perspective. Jodi, are you the first? You're the first to speak?
I guess so. Yep.
Okay. Then signal me and I'll move our slides along for you.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, yes, well, thank you for coming and for allowing me to have this opportunity to talk about things that I had not thought about for a long time until the events of last month at the Capitol in Washington, as you can see. So as these events unfolded, of course, I was very shocked and disturbed, just like millions of other Americans, at all this. But I also experienced a sense of deja vu that I think most Americans would not have experienced. And that had to do with my circumstances almost exactly 40 years previously, 40 years before, on the 23rd of February, 1981. So we're in this week. We were thinking about even trying to have it on Tuesday, the 23rd, but our schedules didn't mesh, so we're 2 days out. But this is, something that in Spain, no doubt, there were many programs on television and people talking about the 40th anniversary after what happened. So I'll talk for a moment about where I was in Madrid, and then we'll have the visual to show you what I found out was going on. So on February 23rd, 1981, that was a Monday, and I was doing what I was doing just about every day in work, certainly Monday through Saturday, which was doing research for my doctoral dissertation. So I was there in Madrid and sometimes other cities in Spain doing research for my doctoral dissertation, which is actually on a part of Spain in the 16th century, 500 years earlier. So I didn't realize I was going to have this quick lesson in contemporary Spanish politics and history as well. So I was in the National Library, the Biblioteca Nacional, which is right in the middle of central Madrid. And usually it closed at 9 at night, and I was usually there pretty much to the end, but I decided to leave early that day because I had occasion to buy a gift for someone, and I wanted to check out a certain shop in the area before it closed. So I left more like somewhere between 6:30 and 7. Went out onto the street. There's a big avenue in front of Castellana, which is usually a very broad and elegant boulevard there. And suddenly, it was extremely loud with these just screaming of police sirens. Suddenly I started hearing these police sirens. And I remember thinking, wow, there must have been a terrible traffic accident. Must just be an awful accident because of all these police. And then started noticing that as these screaming, sirens were coming one by one down the Castellana, that they weren't police cars, they were vans. They were vans holding multiple police. And it just seemed like it was an endless parade, like 20 of them must have gone by. And I and other people on the street, everybody just sort of stopped and watched this because it was so unusual to see that. And they were also at really top speed, which would be very unusual in this otherwise just very heavily used area of central Madrid. Then eventually they passed. So then I went to this shop I was talking about nearby. And when I went in, I saw that everyone in the shop who worked there and the customers were all crowded around. On the front counter, they had a radio put down there, and everybody was crowded and listening to the radio. Now, I must point out something, especially for people who are younger than myself and some others. This is 1981. There's no internet. There's no, it's almost hard to imagine. There's no internet, there's no mobile phones of any sort. Everyone was completely dependent on radio, television, and then newspapers the following day. I know I feel like I'm talking about 400 years ago, but that was the case. So everybody, they had procured some radio, and everybody was huddling around listening to the radio, and I was listening to, and all of a sudden with the news person, the news reporter, and suddenly we heard the word golpe, which means coup, a coup d'état. Wow. And as you know more, and then we all understood that the in fact the police, all these police and armed people were on their way to the Cortes building, which is the Parliament building, also right in a very central part of Madrid, about a 20-minute walk, perhaps, from where I was. So I guess we can change the slide now. We can show you what was going on. Yeah. So what we found out, what I found out, is that in fact there had been a meeting of the Parliament, with the lower house of the Parliament, but very, very similar, and to ratify an election that had recently happened. So this is one of the reasons why this was so eerie for people who knew the history of Spain, that it, like what happened, like in the Capitol on January 6th, you had all the politicians filling up the rows of this Parliament building, and in the process of ratifying a presidential election. And at about 6:20, I mean, I found out later, at about 6:20 that afternoon, doors slammed open, and this man who you see, Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero, and about 200 other soldiers stormed into the building, and he, with his gun in his hand, and he started shouting, you know, nobody move, you know, everybody listen up. And as you can see, his soldiers are armed with submachine guns. Hopefully saw that. And then at one point, when I think there was some confusion and some people were moving around, they gave the order, you know, hit the floor, al suelo. And there you can see all these politicians and journalists and so on. They are cowering on the floor. So that's another similarity, if you will, an eerie similarity with those images from our Capitol in Washington, with when all the members of Congress were told to get down on the floor. So to come back to just my reminiscences, oops, I've had time. Here I am, you know, in this commercial area, about 20 minutes away, and you know, at a time like this, you don't necessarily think rationally. I actually everybody was very disturbed. I was not scared in the sense that I thought that something would happen to this, you know, North American graduate student, you know, during this coup. But if in fact it really was a military coup, I also didn't want to be around. So I made a very quick exit, and I just thought the sort of overwhelming impulse was, I got to get home. Home meant apartment that I was sharing with 3 other students, Spanish students. And I just thought, you know, I would rather be with people than not. So that was one thing, to just kind of get home. The other thing, and so what I did was actually is I walked out and I just went into the closest stop of the metro, of the subway system, even though I knew it wasn't the correct line. Somehow I felt safer going underground. In a normal situation, I would walk for a little while and then go into a subway line that was the correct one to get home. But instead, I just kind of popped down into the closest one, took that train, and then changed lines a few times. Got home, and sure enough, my 3 apartment mates were all there, also crowded around radio. We did not have a television in that. And as I had expected, my apartment mates not only had out the radio, but they had out a shortwave radio, which one of them had bought some years before, so that she could practice her English actually by listening to the BBC. So we had that on too, because we had no idea if at any minute the radio was going to be cut. Both at that time, both the television and the radio was nationalized, was the Spanish national. So if they had these golpistas, what do we call it, like coup makers, people trying to take over, if they took over the radio station and the television station, we knew we wouldn't be able to get any information. And I found out later that yes, in fact, they actually did take over the radio station for about 2 hours, apparently, but then went back. What these soldiers did not realize, though, perhaps, or just weren't concerned about, is that television cameras kept rolling because, again, they were filming it. So there, too, it was a little bit like what happened in Washington, where so many people had their cell phones and stuff, that it was kind of like watching a coup or an attack as it happened, you know, in real time. So later, that's where many of the really iconic photos like this were stills from the television cameras or from the many journalists who were there to cover the political event. So it was a very scary evening. What we found out later, and then also saw footage, was that in another city, the city on the East Coast, Valencia, a very important city, another co-conspirator general had brought out something like 2,000 soldiers and tanks. And you can Google, if you Google, I was impressed at how much was on the internet. You can see these images, and you can also see on YouTube the video clips, because all of this was taped. And you can see clips of these tanks rolling down the streets in Valencia. So, you know, it was a very scary time. It wasn't until the following day that these people gave up. And what had happened, the key thing is really late in about 1 or 2 a.m., the King of Spain, Juan Carlos II at the time, got on television, and he put on all of his military gear, like totally full of medals and things, as the commander-in-chief, and made a very brief speech, but went right to the point and said, "I do not approve of this, that I am the king of a democratic, parliamentary country, and these people have subverted the Constitution, and I don't approve of it." And that's what really started to make this unravel, because many of these conspirators were saying that they were doing it in the name of the king. So when the king said, "No, I don't use my name because I don't approve of any of this," then this started to unravel. And the following day, the 24th of February around noon, is when they finally left, and all the people inside, everybody was being held hostage. In fact, they could finally leave as well. So there are some of my recollections. I'll be happy to talk to people about just what my own, and also I emailed some friends who were there at the time, and I tried to read up a bit about this as well. So I'll try to answer to questions if I can. Oh, did we want to show the other slide just to show the close-up? There it is. Oh, you know what? Maybe this is something that bears explanation. You can see that Colonel Tejero is wearing a really strange-looking hat. These were the hats. This was very distinctive hats of what was called, it still exists, but called the Guardia Civil, the civil guard. And the civil guard was really feared in Spain, as they were the sort of personal troops of Francisco Franco, who had been the right-wing sort of fascist dictator for the 35 years until he died in 1975. So these people were like his loyalists, who were sort of trying to bring back this kind of regime. And so Tejero apparently had a joint membership in the army, but also in the Guardia Civil, because he's the only one wearing this hat. The other people are wearing more standard army hats. So it may be that he was just trying to, for the fear element of that, to put that in and kind of remind people that this was what the Franco regime stood for, a kind of militarized control that they were sorry was over. And we're now getting nostalgic and we're evoking the name of the king in order to bring back some kind of military regime. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, as people were watching what was happening on January 6th, it was probably so particularly jarring to people, partly because they associated it with things that happened in other countries. kind of what Jodi's been describing with the scene that she witnessed in Spain 40 years ago. But actually, there have been a number of situations in the United States where violence and intimidation was part of elections, and even where coercion was used to overthrow democratically elected governments. So I just wanted to brief, and probably some of the most dramatic examples are actually from the late 19th century South. I want to just tell you about two instances that happened then, and then bring it back to how that's related to what happened on January 6th. So the two that I was going to talk about was the 1875 state elections in Mississippi. And a lot of my work is on Mississippi, so I know that story pretty well, although there are a lot of other examples from the Reconstruction period. And then the 1898 coup, which overthrew a local government in Wilmington, North Carolina. So the Reconstruction events, just a little reminder for those of you that aren't that familiar with what happened during Reconstruction. Reconstruction was that roughly 10-year period after the Civil War. And the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and then the 15th Amendment had provided for Black men to be allowed to vote and participate in the political process. And so partly they helped build a Republican Party in the South. The Republican Party was, of course, the party of Lincoln and emancipation. The Democrats, on the other hand, were the party of secession and slavery. And they did this in alliance with a number of local white citizens in the South, as well as some Northern Republicans who had come South after the war. And they were partly successful because at that time, almost every Southern state had a very sizable Black population, and a number of the states, including Mississippi, there was actually a Black majority. Whites, as you might, white Democrats especially, because of course there were white Republicans, but white Democrats were particularly upset about this. And throughout Reconstruction, they used violence and intimidation to try to thwart Black political activity. And in fact, to thwart almost every kind of Black activism that happened after the Civil War. The federal government had only limited success in kind of stopping the violence, especially around voting and elections, because under our constitutional system, state elections and qualifications for voters are primarily the province of the states, not the federal government. In fact, the talk about voting qualifications in the 14th and 15th Amendment was the first time, and those amendments had just been passed, the first time that was ever done in the Constitution. And we still don't really have much of a guidance from the Constitution about who should be allowed to vote and who shouldn't. Anyway, in 1875, the Democrats had been out of power for a number of years, and they pretty much decided as the 1875 state elections approached that they were going to retake the state. In fact, they openly admitted that if they could take it peaceably, they would, but they would use violence if necessary. And during the 1875 elections, there was quite a bit of violence. I remember years ago looking at something called microfilm at the National Archives. There was basically a whole roll of microfilm that were nothing but complaints about this particular election. In fact, now you can look at those same documents here at UNCG in our history vault. It's one of the modules in the history vault. Those same letters are there. It's a lot easier to use. But I'll give you just one example from then. There were a county in East Mississippi, which was a Black majority county. One of the people that wrote at the time about what was happening during the election was the district attorney there. And some of his language was really, I thought, pretty interesting. He said that during the election, quote, the exhibition of firearms was public and notorious. And he said that cannon was, quote, used as the loudest argument. On the night before the election, there was a really riotous kind of Democratic rally. And in the aftermath of that, 4 Black Republicans were killed in town. Several were wounded. The Black candidate for sheriff, his house was burned. A number of white Republicans were run out of town. And on election day, in 5 Black majority counties in Mississippi, where there had been large Republican majorities in the previous elections that had taken place. There was a total of 25 Republican votes. So it was, the intimidation worked. It almost disappeared overnight. There were a number of pre-election fights and during the election where a number of Black people were killed. Whites kind of came into a lot of these towns, especially some of the bigger towns where there were Black majorities, heavily armed. In Vicksburg, they reportedly came into town and wrote the names of potential Republican voters down in what they called dead books. So the implication there was pretty obvious what was going on. In that election, the Democrats succeeded in winning the state legislature back. And after they had done that, they went to take over the rest of the government because the governor and the lieutenant governor were not up for election that year. But they impeached the lieutenant governor, who was actually a Black man. And once they successfully did that, they threatened the governor with impeachment and really forced him to resign. And that way, the third person in line, which was the president of the new Senate, which was a Democrat, he took over as governor. So in that situation, you had both violence and intimidation during the election, but also essentially a coup that took place after the election to overthrow the governor and the lieutenant governor. During these events, the governor actually called on federal help, but President Grant refused to send any kind of federal troops to Mississippi. He said at the time that the Northern public was tired out of Southern problems and they didn't really want to get involved. There was a huge Senate investigation afterwards. I'm sure we'll have a big investigation about what happened on January 6th. And the conclusion was that it was this 1875 election in Mississippi was, quote, blood-soaked. And the conclusion was also that it was one of the darkest chapters in American history. But in the end, nothing really happened. In the period after Reconstruction ended for about a decade and a half, there was still quite a few Black voters and Black office holders, but the Democrats were increasingly mobilized to try to gain and maintain power. And one of the things they tried to do was basically make sure that there was only one party in the South, and that was the Democratic Party. Because what they had seen in Reconstruction was that if white people split their votes, then Black voters would hold the balance of power. And so they tried to encourage this kind of one-party state. And that was not always successful. One place it was not successful was in 1890s North Carolina, where farmers in the 1890s were disgruntled with the Democratic Party, many farmers, because they seemed to be the party of railroads and corporations and didn't really do much to help the farmers. And so they decided to form a political alliance with the Republican Party again, which was at that time mostly Black. And in 1894, both 1894 and 1896, they swept the statewide offices, what they called this fusion government of the populists and the Republicans. They swept the statewide offices and the state legislature. And so as the 1898 elections approached, the Democrats, white Democrats, made kind of the same calculation that those white Democrats had made in Mississippi back in the 1870s, is that they were going to retake the state government, whether they had to do it by force or they could do it peaceably. One of the things they did prior to the election was launch what came to be known as a white supremacy campaign. And it really was a disinformation campaign, which is kind of interesting because, of course, we might think that's just a 21st century thing. But what they basically were doing was spreading a lot of propaganda before the election. One of the things they talked about was that they said that North Carolina was dominated by Black Republicans and Black government. At that time, North Carolina still had a Black population of about 33%. And yet, if you look at where Blacks were in government, there was one Black congressman. There were 10 Blacks in the legislature. There were 10 city aldermen who were Black across the state, and there was a smattering of other offices. It wasn't exactly Black domination, but that was the story they told. The other part of the disinformation campaign was to try to strike fear into people by saying that all the white women of the state were basically endangered, as they put it, because of the threat from what they called the Black beast rapists, which was basically all Black men were threatening white women. This campaign was successful. Not only the campaign, but the violence that was used during the election, and the Democrats won control over state government again in 1898. But in Wilmington, there weren't city elections that year, and the fusion government still was in control firmly in Wilmington. And at that time, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina with the huge population of 20,000 people, but that's in 1898, that was the largest city in the state. It was also a Black majority city, and it was a city that had a very large Black professional and middle class. So it was a thriving place. In the days after the election, basically a white mob decided that, why should they have to live under this fusion government when the state had been, taken back over by the white Democrats? And so they just essentially launched an insurrection against the sitting city government. In the events that happened on November 10th, 1898, scores of Black people were killed. We don't really know how many, but the estimates have been anywhere from 60 to 300. And many more than that were run out of town, not just Blacks, but also prominent whites, prominent Blacks who were involved with the fusion government were run out of town. In the aftermath of that, and this was already happening in other places in the 1890s, North Carolina and other southern states sought to remove Blacks from politics permanently to avoid this situation, they thought, through disfranchisement. And they actually even pitched it as a reform that, to end the violence that surrounded elections, violence that they themselves were perpetuating. They said it was necessary to remove Blacks from politics. So how does this tie in this maybe ancient history with what happened on January 6, 2021? Well, the most obvious thing is that during that event, you also had ideas about white supremacy and fear of Black participation, as well as other non-white participation in politics as a major factor in what happened on January 6th, this effort to try to overthrow a democratically elected government. Of course, it's not something that was just confined to Southerners, though, in 2021, and partly that has to do also with the history of what happened in this country. So in the late 19th century, Black people were still mainly in the South, but over the course of the 20th century, African-American migration to all parts of the country made race a national issue. It also made anti-Black violence and anti-democratic violence nationalized as well over the course of and one of the things I was struck by as I've been looking at who's been arrested for participating in January 6th is how many of these people are not from the South, but of course they're espousing, these kind of white supremacist ideas that back in the 19th century were animating the same kind of violence against democratically elected governments. One of the ironies to me too of this is that one of the reasons why they were unsuccessful on January 6th is in part the thing that helped the people that were trying to overthrow government in the late 19th century, and that is that elections, states still have control over much of the election machinery and who's qualified to vote. And we saw a number of state officials around the country that kind of acted to kind of prevent what this mob was trying to do on January 6th. So, going forward, will there be another effort to try to assault the federal government in the same way? Well, it could happen. We could have the same event that, happen again. But I think what's more likely, and it seems like it's already happening, is that there's going to be a renewed effort in the states to try to restrict voting and to try to eliminate Black voters, other non-white voters. It's been amazing. The New York Times had a story just the other day that already since January 6th, there have been over 165 bills that have been filed in 33 states to restrict voting. So I think that's where, this is not going to go away, but this kind of violence and intimidation and effort to limit the vote that we saw in the late 19th century South is kind of still alive today. And white supremacy is still driving a lot of it.
Thank you, Jodi and Chuck, for your presentations. And we still have some time for questions. So does anyone want to offer the first questions to our speakers? This is really the nature of this. We're opening this up to a freewheeling discussion at this point.
And maybe let's stop share screen, and so we'll see that grid view so we can see it. Yeah,
The Hollywood squares.
I had a question for Jodi then. In the aftermath of the coup, what happened to those participants? Was it similar to what's happened since January 6th? Were people suddenly shown up in the newspaper and then there were charges formally made to, or was this more of a quiet, was it a different era for sort of official response?
I'll answer to the best of my ability, and I'm also delighted that our colleague Mia, who is a genuine native of Madrid and was there too younger than I was, but he stayed longer in Spain, so might be I'd be delighted to have your comments too.
Sorry to interrupt. There seems to be something that's happened to your mic towards the end of your talk and now, where it's very garbled.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what's.
Well, I couldn't hear Chuck very well because it sounded like there was all kinds of static on his microphone.
Okay.
So there's something. Is it? I'm going to try to get closer to the microphone. Is that better? If I stand like right there at my microphone?
It's still a little garbled. Yeah.
It's garbled. Yeah. Well, Chuck's was terribly garbled. I had trouble hearing.
Are you on a
I don't know
low
why that
battery?
is. No, mine is plugged in, so it can't be that. Okay.
Okay,
Result
so
of a
connection issue. Yeah.
Okay. Well, shall I just keep going? Because but yeah, I had a lot. It was, I could understand what Chuck said, but it was all very garbled, like having disturbance on the line.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt then, because both coming from you and your reception is garbled, but we could hear Chuck just fine. It sounds silly, but can you unplug and your computer still run? Because sometimes the electronics will respond.
There
we go.
Really better to put on the battery. Try.
Sorry to do troubleshooting midway. But,
Does anyone else have any questions or questions for Chuck?
By the way, I've been teaching using Zoom and everything, so it doesn't happen all the time. I just unplugged from the wall outlet. Does it make any difference?
no.
No. Yeah, I can't explain it because in fact, I had a Zoom meeting at 10 o'clock this morning and we didn't have any trouble. So whatever that comment about the connection, maybe the connection to UNCG campus, because I'm not on campus, I'm in my house in Chapel Hill.
You were fine at the beginning.
Yeah.
For most of it.
Yeah.
But for me, was I the only one who heard Chuck's voice is very garbled?
Yeah.
He was clear.
Chuck sounded fine to us.
Yeah, he was fine on my end.
Okay, well, I
We
don't
can
have,
try and understand you. Go for it.
Yeah.
okay, well, should I keep talking even though I sound weird? Because to me, Chuck sounded, it's moving like what Chuck sounded. Okay, I will try to answer Jeff's question. And as I said, maybe Anna can feel free to come in too, because you know this better than I do. That yes, these soldiers, Tejero and these other people were arrested, and there was a trial, and many of them were jailed. But there were very controversial, needless to say, and there are people who grumbled about various things. One is that some of them were let out, after not a very long amount of time. I think there was one general in particular, not Tejero, but another one who was kind of old at the time, and then they sort of, said, oh, well, he's old, we'll let him go. And then the main thing that has been going on, ever from that time ever since, are lots of theories that this was a much deeper conspiracy, and that really only the people who really were behind it, the real plotters, were not brought to justice. And it was particularly a lot of suspicion against a man that another is one of the things that's ironic. He was a lieutenant colonel, in fact, it was a general inside that the Parliament building, who got up and started to remonstrate with him, saying, I'm ahead of you in rank, I'm above you in rank, you can't order me around. And then they were armed, and they just sort of pushed him away. So anyway, there's this other general whose last name is Armada. So this sort of is hilarious because that means armed in Spanish. And he had was a special liaison of the military to the royal family, to the king. So there's been sort of theories all along that while it is true that the king came out, he was definitely seen as the hero. There were people who were talking about nominating him for a Nobel Peace Prize and all kinds of things. There were also theories that maybe they knew more and they could have warned people about it. And then Tejero was let out of prison, and as far as I know, he's still alive. And I think he recently, did you hear this, Anna, that he recently made some appearance at some event that brought back other old Franquistas?
Yes, Tejero is still alive. And it was my understanding until recently he was coming in and out of prison in this regime of kind of like it happens with some type of crimes that there's no danger of so they're allowed to come in and out of prison. He's one of them. And it could, I mean, I'm not aware of a particular presence in any political meeting, but he does go to family meetings and to weddings and to family reunions. So he's allowed to have a normal life. My understanding of what happened afterwards is that, well, it's hard to know what really happened, but there was a staging of a trial and a staging of some form of repercussions. And the main figures that were identified as the responsible schemers were officially taken to prison, so everyone could see that there are consequences. But it is true that who were really behind and why these two figures were chosen, was there somebody else involved, and were they all really brought to justice, or just a few chosen ones to make sure that we all, society, knew or saw a resemblance of justice. So, but one of the Valencia one, there was a general in Valencia, he brought the tanks out of the street, and he was very old at that point, and I think he's already dead. Tejero was in his 30s when this happened, so he really grew old in prison.
Well, that really, what you just said really kind of sparks something about, the figureheads that are behind things versus those that take the fall. And I'm curious if maybe, Chuck, you have any insights, or if anybody here has any kind of thoughts about the recent events and kind of how is prosecution proceeding, who is actually held accountable, is definitely a poignant of the period relationship.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask Chuck that same question. This is Rodney with the Greensboro History Museum.
Hey, Rodney.
But in the research I've done with the Wilmington Massacre in 1898, it was a lot of pre-planning that was done, and there was more of a conspiratorial arm, like days leading up to the riot. No ammo would be sold to the African Americans, so they wouldn't lessen the potential that they would fight back. And I wanted to know your thoughts about likening that to the lack of acknowledgement that there was some higher ups that were behind the events of January 6th. And, it was just kind of shut down so as not to reveal that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, it seems like there's a mob, in Wilmington on November 10th, but that mob was put into, action partly by the white supremacy campaign that had been led by, leading political figures like Charles Aycock, who used to have his name on the auditorium here, or Furnifold Simmons, or, the one of the primary newspapers in the state, the News and Observer, had been, very outspoken in promoting this. So, yeah, I mean, there were clearly people that were promoting things. And obviously it wasn't just a random mob. I think you're right. You know, people were gathering up. I mean, one of the first things they went after was, you know, Alexander Manly's newspaper there in Wilmington, which, you know, was a leading kind of, you know, voice for the Black community in Wilmington. And, you know, one of the first things they did was burn down his office. And, you know, there's that famous picture of them posed in front of the, you know, his office. So clearly they weren't just acting randomly. They knew that, you know, that they were going to take action, and there were people that weren't there who certainly put this all in motion. And I guess that happens a lot of times. You know, there are always, you know, there are people that, you know, well, we saw in, you know, on January 6th, there are people that inflame people to do things, and then they're not there themselves to actually participate. But they set it in motion, and that the same thing happened in Wilmington in 1898. It happened with a lot of the Reconstruction violence too. I mean, it was, you know, people at the very top of these Democratic parties in these southern states that were, you know, egging their supporters on to attack, you know, Blacks who were trying to vote or who were politicians or other exercising their autonomy in other ways. So, but they didn't necessarily do it themselves. They were always, you know, they were getting other people to do the dirty work.
And it was kind of a long game.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was, you know, between the, you know, if you go back a couple of decades and follow that through, and we're kind of looking from 1877 forward, you know, what the compromise occurred. But then if you look across the state, it was definitely a long game there for a while before we got to 1898. And then if you look at, like, look at the, and I can't remember the guy's name, the one that became mayor in Wilmington. Now his name escapes me. Anyway, I mean, he was
Waddle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, his oratory on a number of occasions, and tied in with the group that was like ACOC and so on, that was really leading the disinformation campaign for a good decade, along with the News and Observer.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, when the massacre occurred, and then they take over and they put him in as mayor, and
exactly.
Then then we're into Jim Crow for 100 years.
Yeah, I mean they were worried, you know, about the security of white supremacy, and so they were, you know, and like I said, even as horrible as the things that happened during Reconstruction, and as much as Black voters and politicians were intimidated, they continued to vote and participate in politics in pretty large numbers after Reconstruction, and that's why you get this kind of renewed violence in the 1890s, is because, you know, whites who oppose this had never really given up, or, you know, they just, you know, and the reason why you get disfranchisement campaigns in the 1890s is that was their final solution. It's like, okay, enough of this already, you know, this kind of interracial cooperation in politics. We're going to remove Blacks completely from the equation, and then we won't have to deal with this anymore.
Yeah, one of the really telling documents that we have, and I forget what year it's from, is a disenfranchised document from the state where it's a list of Black voters, and it pretty much says, if they show up at the polls, stop them.
It's like the dead books that I was referring to in Vicksburg during 1875. It was literally, you know, those people were targeted because they were politically active. Yeah.
We're looking at actually one of the next project we're currently working on is North Carolina Democracy Project. Will be our next exhibit, and we've gone back and forth of how to approach it. And with all the events that's been happening lately, the approach I'm really trying to go for is exactly tying what's been happening today in a number of instances back through Carolina history, and certainly Wilmington in '98, and that whole coup has now will become a huge part of this.
Sure.
Yeah.
I said,
Jodi?
Yeah. So I've been thinking, this is wonderful, and I've been thinking a lot over, last month about both similarities and differences between the events in 1981 in Spain, and then last month here in the United States. And at first, after the somewhat superficial but still kind of eerie similarity of it having to be just the time when they're ratifying a vote, and you have all the politicians together and people hovering on the floor and stuff. But apart from that, people were pointing out, but other realize it's really very different. After all, there was a British writer who wrote about this, and he said, in his very British way, he said, the one in 1981 was a proper military coup. That is to say, not that it was good, but that it was real military, people, as you could see, not, mob, and so on and so forth. But as I've been starting to think about it, I realize, of course, this is all we're going to find out, hopefully, more in the future with, and I suspect not so much with congressional hearings, but with the media, with people in newspapers and in the media doing investigations. A lot of them already are, and leaks. So that we're finding out some things. It's something Anna and I emailed about too. Now we're beginning to find out that some of these groups, such as one called, is it the Oath Keepers, who are predominantly made up of ex-military. So it is different. So yes, it's not a proper military coup in quite the same way, but it's not, it's not like the military has been left out of this either. Another thing my eyes were opened quite a bit by reading a book. Amazing we have in Jackson Library. This one by Anna too. It's called Anatomy. There's actually an English translation. So in English it would be called The Anatomy of a Moment. But we have the Spanish one. Sarkis is actually a novelist, not a political scientist or anything. So it makes it like a novel. It's really interesting to read. Anyway, one of the things that really struck me was about the role of newspapers. Okay, so that's getting back to, I'm glad you mentioned, Chuck, about the News Observer and Wally and so on. And it can really work both ways. So that there were these very conservative, very right-wing newspapers, including one whose name I'm now not remembering because I had to know about it, that was primarily for the army. I think Kassar or something like that, which means the fortress. So it's kind of like the Stars and Stripes, it was specifically for the army. And leading up to it, there were things that were saying, like, gee, all the politicians are going to be together at this time, and somebody should really tell them, about the problems the country is facing and so on. So when you look back, you can see that there were sort of precedent. But on the other hand, I think very important is the role of what was really completely new phenomenon in Spain, and that was the first free press since the death of Franco in 1975-76, and the emergence of El País, which is still a major newspaper of the country or the nation. I didn't even think that much about it. As an American, I just arrived there and it's like, of course I'll read El País, and that's where I found out so many things. But a newspaper like that would not have been permitted. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of censorship under Franco. So you can have newspapers both as the media, let's say, broaden it out to our times, right? You can have that. There can be the instigators, of violence this way, but they can also be the exposés, the people that are going to expose some of the corruption and problems behind the scenes. I had mentioned about how there was no internet and stuff in 1981. So the next day I went out and bought copies of El País. Everybody was buying. They must have done I don't know how many editions. I mean, it was just crazy, and big headlines and so on. And I kept those newspapers for many years because I knew I was experiencing history. I knew I was witnessing history, and I had no notion that someday there would be something like the internet, and you could just, at your fingertips, get all those images and the stories. And so somewhere along the line, I was looking, and I couldn't find them. Somewhere along the line, when I moved, I didn't keep them. But I'd say probably up to about the end of the 1990s, I kept those newspapers. So I like to think, but I like to hope anyway that there's still a role for the media, and especially people in the media who have good training in history.
Good plug for history.
Well, and I like the comment of thinking about the free press had just opened again, and that, I don't know, there's something about like the shift in press in the past decade in the United States and the way that information is perceived or received that has been, people think opening, but actually is this narrowing of channels, as we all know. And the sense of that,
siloing of readers.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if those followers of Franco, of course, had their own media that they were consuming prior. I don't know if Anna, if you have any knowledge of like the press at that time and kind of thinking about, I mean, of course, there were always these organizational kind of structures that are behind the scenes, that people belong to this club, they belong to this group, that would support and kind of wanted to revitalize that kind of model of government. But it's interesting to try and think historically about the parallels between political organizations, secret organizations, kind of the behind the scenes political organizations that created the disinformation campaigns about, you know, the rape of the Southern white woman that Chuck talked about, you know, all these things working behind the scenes, but now they're all online. And so we have more traces of them in some ways. And yet we do we? Because the archival preservation of online information is such a struggle. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you've run into this, but from the 90s until today, I have problems with images, with files, things getting corrupted, not being accessible, CDs, oh God, it's the worst. But kind of there's this archival gap, but now we think we're going to preserve everything. We think we can track everything down later, and just kind of roughing off of what Jodi said about preserving this newspapers, but really how can we, amidst the piles of data that we have a sense of archive? It's actually something that's been plaguing my mind of late. So I'm curious to talk to a bunch of historians about it. Any ideas about this, or like reflections on this whole concept of like archive and the political machinations of overthrow?
Well, I mean, it's a information overload in many ways. I mean, there's so much information, and as a historian, how would you, you know, ever get through all of that? I mean, you know, one advantage of working in the 19th century is there's a limited amount of source material compared to working in the 20th century. When there's just, you know, and at first there's just a ton of paper, and then once the internet comes in, there's all these electronic records as well. And it is different too, because people, I think, are more aware about what they're more conscious about leaving a record, and so they consciously, you know, kind of shape that record. I think about, you know, people like, well, we could look into Facebook post, and you know, that would tell us about the past. But the thing we have to remember is that it's unlike somebody who may have written a letter in the 19th century and not had any specific purpose other than to communicate with the person they're writing to. People that leave a Facebook post, they're totally curating their own personality as they're writing that post, and so, you know, you have to filter it through that. So it's a whole nother level of trying to interpret documents, I think, or source material.
You're muted, Robert. I think it's your headphones.
Sorry, just not even looking at history, but just looking at the last year. One of the things in this Pieces of Now exhibit is I've got a projection of a timeline projection of major events as they occur every month. And it's interesting to look back across. But in trying to do that and keep up with it at the beginning of 2020 was relatively easy. And it was, you know, there'd be a major headline maybe once a week, every 2 weeks. But as we get into September, October, November, there's 20 headlines every day at least. And trying to archive that has been difficult and a challenge, to say the least.
Well, it reminds me of the new skills that students of history need to learn about mining big data and the kind of digital humanities projects that, you know, we're all kind of scrambling to keep up with. Some of us better than others, and I don't know, I feel land somewhere in the middle, but it's such a challenge. Yep. to learn the skills that might help build the narratives. I don't know, to make sense of history.
But there are also some advantages. I mentioned the history vault that we have here, which is an unbelievable amount of documents that, of course, you can search by keyword. You know, I literally, you know, years ago when I was looking at the 1875 Mississippi election, I was rolling through this microfilm trying to, you know, read these letters, but they was making me go blind, and, now I can just like put in a search word and all this stuff just comes up, on my screen. So there are some advantages, but it's also a challenge because of the overload of information, I think.
You mentioned, well, a couple of quick things because I know we're going to run out of time. I have sort of a different fear, and I just had a conversation about this in one of my classes with my students, and that is with all of this, but it's all digital, electronic. In other words, nothing is on paper, nothing is very firm. And I wonder if historians in the future are going to have anything left of us to talk about, because we're going on the assumption that the technology is going to stay the same, and you can just plug in. Well, we don't know that. So there's some this comes in a connection from that letters. Collections of letters, which are so valuable for doing, pre-modern history and what have you. But nobody writes letters anymore, right? It's all email, and we're just assuming that people are going to be able to recover.
I don't know what happens to my email when I delete it. Where does it go?
Say,
You don't know.
I'm just teasing. But actually, it does bring up. Oh, I was going to respond to your thing, Jodi. I was going to respond because actually it's been a challenge that I can't find images from the 80s and 90s because everybody thought they were digitized from South Africa. And it's only the ones that were done in, that more hard copy version that I can find on some of them. I'm going through newsletters from the 90s, which is ridiculous because there were digital files, but they're gone. But somebody put it on a disk, burned it, and that thing is not working anymore. But so the long-term longevity of archival, I'm sure there are kind of folks here who know how, and also whose histories get into those more long-term archives that actually get preserved. That obviously is
curation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have the flyer? I was going to make the announcement for it. Then.
Oh, here it is. Definitely have it on my desktop somewhere. No, I just have to shrink 3 things.
It was for your talk coming up for them.
Oh yeah. Wait for it. Oh, there it is. Found it.
Or do we have any last comments from our presenters or our audience? We still have an audience. No.
I do welcome you all to March 12th. Couldn't hear Jodi? Oh, so I welcome you all to March 12th, where we're having African Art and Repatriation, Benin and Institutional Relations with myself and Amanda Maples, who is working with the Digital Benin Project in Hamburg, Germany. I set this up for a class, but then I thought, why should only 25 people get to actually see this one? Because we're going to be talking about the actual repatriation efforts that are going on the ground with collaborations between Nigeria and Germany, and the huge team she's working with. So that should be a lot of fun. So that's the next one.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Well, thanks to Chuck and Jodi for speaking to us here.
We'll have time to end with 2 more quick comments, and maybe Chuck has a quick thing too.
Yes.
I'm going to end with 2 things that are in the field of material culture, which is another thing that the historians are now being sensitized to and are trying to preserve and so on. Anna, I hope you don't mind if I share your something that you emailed to me because I thought it was just so wonderful. So I'm just going to when during this attack, these guys with the machine guns started, they wanted everybody to be quiet and get under their chairs, their seats and everything, and they started just firing up at the ceiling. And that was one of the scariest things, that people just hearing this on the radio, we just heard all these shots. People thought there would be just bodies all over the floor. It's sort of amazing that they weren't. So they shot up the ceiling of this, elegant 19th century parliament building. Anna commented, she says, the bullet holes were supposed to remain in the ceiling as a reminder of democracy's fragility. But alas, in 2013, they were fixed. They fixed the ceiling. Nobody knows who gave the order. Oh well, even the reminders of fragility are fragile. Thank you, Anna. I think that's wonderful. And then I wanted to share, and then right after, a few months after the coup, actually, in a different part of Spain, though, there was a lot of graffiti, a little bit different from the United States. In Spain, especially at that time, graffiti was always political. You know, so people had all kinds of different political slogans. And somebody had on the wall after this had written, "Democracia es una trampa." Democracy is a trick. You know, that's worth thinking about. I wish I would see, if we had cell phones like the kind we have now, I would whip mine out and photograph that. You know, because that's lost. It's just in my memory, but I never forgot it.
Chuck, do you have anything?
Want to make a final?
Though I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to talk and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes.
We
thank-
welcome you back the next time.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jody.
Bye.